Berlin, 1942. A heavy, unmarked van prowls the wet streets of the government district. Inside, technicians from the Funkabwehr, the radio counterintelligence unit, are sweating over their equipment. They are wearing headphones, turning dials, hunting for a ghost. For weeks they have been picking up a signal. It's a radio transmission, coded, fast, and professional. It appears every night. The terrifying part isn't the message itself. It's the location. The triangulation isn't pointing to a resistance cell in a basement in the slums. It isn't pointing to a communist hideout in the factories. The needles on their equipment are swinging violently towards the heart of the Third Reich. They are pointing toward the Air Ministry. They are pointing toward the offices of the aristocracy. The men in the van are terrified to report this, because in Nazi Germany, accusing the elite of treason is a good way to end up in a camp yourself. But the signal is undeniable. Someone inside the highest levels of the German military machine is talking to Moscow. When the report finally lands on the desk of Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, his reaction isn't just anger. It is a cold, confusing shock. The Gestapo is the immune system of the Reich. They are the watchers. They are the ones who make people disappear for a whispered joke. The idea that an Allied spy ring could be operating right under their noses, literally inside the buildings they guard, shatters their reality. It meant that the Black Corps, the SS, had failed. This is the story of the Red Orchestra, and how the discovery of high-level spies inside Berlin triggered a wave of paranoia that tore the SS apart from the inside. It's the story of what happens when the people who trust no one realize they were right all along. Before we go into next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this. Moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If thousands of you are watching, I hope all 1,000 of you join us. Because this community is growing, and your presence truly matters here. So, to understand the panic, you have to understand the ego of the SS. They called themselves an order. They believed they were the biological and ideological elite of Europe. The Gestapo and the SD, the security service, operated on a premise of total invulnerability. They believed that while the German army might have traitors or cowards, the SS was pure. They were the watchers. Who watches the watchers? Nobody, because they assumed they didn't need it. But here is the statement that defines their failure. Arrogance creates blind spots. Let me explain. The Gestapo spent all their energy looking down. They were hunting Jews, communists, trade unionists, and dissidents among the common people. Their entire surveillance apparatus was designed to crush dissent from below. They never looked sideways. They never looked at the man in the officer's mess drinking champagne with them. They never looked at the woman working in the economics ministry. Here is an example that shows the depth of this blindness. Horosh Schulze-Boyschen was a glamorous figure in Berlin. He was a grandnephew of Admiral Tirpitz. He was a Luftwaffe officer who worked in the Air Ministry. He was married to Libertas, a stunning aristocrat who worked for the film studio MGM. They threw wild parties. They hosted SS officers. They were the golden couple of the Reich. And every night, Harro was typing up secret reports on Luftwaffe strength, tank production, and chemical weapons, and passing them to the Soviets. He wasn't a grimy spy in a trench coat. He was the life of the party. The Gestapo didn't catch him for years because he didn't fit the profile. He was one of us. When the Gestapo finally cracked the codes and realized who the transmitter belonged to, the reaction was denial. One officer reportedly said, "It cannot be Schulze-Boyschen. I had dinner with him last week." This wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was a psychological crisis. If a man like that, a man with the right bloodline, the right uniform, the right friends, could be a spy, then the entire ideology of the SS was a lie. Loyalty wasn't genetic. It was a choice. And people were choosing the other side. The investigation that followed was known as the Sonderkommando Rote Kapelle, Special Detachment Red Orchestra. And this is where the paranoia went from a simmer to a boil. Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, was a man who already trusted no one. But as the names started coming out of the interrogations, he began to see enemies in the wallpaper. The network wasn't just Schulze Boysen. It was Arvid Harnack in the Ministry of Economics. It was Horst Heilmann in the cipher section of the High Command. Think about that. The man responsible for encoding German military secrets was working for the Russians. The reaction inside the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, was frantic. They weren't just trying to catch spies anymore. They were trying to cover up their own incompetence. How do you explain to Hitler that the enemy has been reading your mail for 3 years? The SS officers began to turn on each other. They started looking for scapegoats. Who vetted him? Who signed his security clearance? The atmosphere in the corridors of power changed. You stopped talking freely in the hallways. You stopped trusting your colleagues. One SS investigator noted in his diary the sheer bewilderment of the situation. He wrote about interrogating these captured spies. He expected them to be broken, regretful, or mercenary. Instead, he found them to be intellectual, calm, and morally superior. They told him they weren't betraying Germany, they were saving it from the Nazis. This infuriated the SS officers more than anything. It challenged their worldview. The Red Orchestra bust resulted in dozens of executions. They hung them on meat hooks. They wanted to make an example. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Every time a battle was lost on the Eastern Front, every time a U-boat was sunk, the SS leadership wondered, was it bad luck, or is there another radio transmitter in the room next door? But the Red Orchestra was just the beginning. The real nightmare for the SS was the realization that their own intelligence services were effectively at war with each other. You see, Nazi Germany had 2 main spy agencies: the RSHA, controlled by the SS, and the Abwehr, military intelligence, controlled by the army. The SS hated the Abwehr. They saw them as old-fashioned, aristocratic reactionaries. But they assumed they were at least on the same side. By 1943 and 1944, that assumption collapsed. The SS began to realize that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, wasn't just incompetent. He was actively sabotaging the war effort. This is the ultimate nightmare for a security officer. The call isn't just coming from inside the house. The other security guard is the one making the call. Walter Schellenberg, the head of SS Foreign Intelligence, had a strange relationship with Canaris. They would go riding together in the Tiergarten Park in Berlin. Schellenberg would try to pump Canaris for information, and Canaris would feed him vague, philosophical warnings. When the SS finally moved against the Abwehr in 1944, absorbing it completely, they opened the files, and what they found made their blood run cold. They found evidence that the Abwehr had been warning the Allies about invasions. They found evidence of agents who were never real. They realized that for years, the eyes of the German army had been intentionally blind. The reaction among the SS leadership was a mixture of rage and validation. "We knew it," they said. "We knew the army officers were traitors." It fueled their radicalization. It convinced them that the SS was the only true pillar of the Reich. But it also meant they were flying blind. By destroying the Abwehr, they cut off their own information flow. They were now the only game in town, and they had no idea if their own networks were compromised. And as we'll see next, they absolutely were. Now we have to talk about the Cicero affair, because it reveals a fascinating paradox in the SS mindset. This is what happens when you catch a spy, but you are too paranoid to believe the truth. In 1943, an Albanian valet named Elyesa Bosna was working for the British ambassador in Turkey. He had access to the ambassador's safe. He started photographing top-secret British documents, plans for the invasion of Europe, bombing targets, political strategies. He walked into the German embassy and offered to sell them. This should have been the greatest intelligence coup of the war. The Germans were being handed the keys to the Allied kingdom. The SS intelligence officers in Berlin received the films. They developed them. The information was genuine. It was explosive. And what did they do? almost nothing. Why? Because the foreign minister, Ribbentrop, and the high-ranking SS officers were convinced it was a trap. They looked at this gold mine and said, "It's too good to be true." The British are trying to feed us false information to lure us into a mistake. This is the irony of total paranoia. When actual intelligence fell into their lap, they couldn't process it. They were so obsessed with the idea of infiltration, so convinced of the cunning of British intelligence, that they paralyzed themselves. Schellenberg later wrote about the frustration of this. He had the documents on his desk. He could see the strategic value, but the toxic atmosphere in Berlin, the fear of being played, the fear of making a mistake that would anger Hitler, meant that the intelligence died in a drawer. They paid Cicero with counterfeit British pounds, a final act of cynicism, but the real cost was their own inability to act. The SS had built a fortress of suspicion so high that they couldn't see out of it anymore. They had caught a spy who was working for them and treated him like he was working against them. If Cicero was a missed opportunity, the double-cross system was a catastrophic humiliation. This wasn't discovered fully until the very end, and for many SS officers, the realization only came during their post-war interrogations. But the creeping suspicion was there in 1944 and 1945. The Germans had sent dozens of agents into Britain. They parachuted them in. They landed them by boat. These agents were supposed to be sending back weather reports, troop movements, and morale assessments. And for years, the radios in Hamburg and Berlin received these reports. The SS analysts moved pins on maps based on this intel. They targeted V-2 rockets based on where these agents said they were landing. What the SS didn't know, or refused to let themselves believe, was that MI5 had captured almost every single one of them. The British gave them a choice: work for us or hang. Most chose to work. By 1944, the entire German intelligence network in Britain was a puppet show run by the British. The SS was listening to a radio play written by their enemies. There were moments when the mask slipped. Sometimes a transmission would have the wrong security check. Sometimes the style of the Morse code operator would change. An alert SS operator in Hamburg might notice. "Agent Fritz sounds different today," he'd say. But the chain of command ignored it. Why? Because the officers in charge needed results. They needed to show Berlin that they had assets in England. Admitting that your entire network might be compromised meant admitting failure. So they suppressed the doubts. They rationalized the errors. "He's just tired," they'd say. "The equipment is faulty. This is the most dangerous thing an intelligence officer can say. It's probably nothing." When the Allies landed at Normandy, the scale of the deception became clear. The German defenses were in the wrong place because their spies had told them the invasion was coming at Calais. The SS officers who realized this in the weeks after D-Day felt a sickening vertigo. They hadn't just been beaten on the battlefield. They had been played like fiddles for years. As the war closed in, the atmosphere in the Gestapo headquarters at Prinz Albrecht Strasse became apocalyptic. The Black Corps was no longer hunting. It was being hunted. The realization of how deeply they had been infiltrated destroyed the internal cohesion of the SS. You have to remember, these men were bound together by a blood oath. They were supposed to be a brotherhood. But by 1945, they were ratting each other out to save their own skins. They started destroying files, not just to hide their crimes from the Allies, but to hide their failures from history. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief, became obsessed with the idea that there were Soviet agents still inside the building. He was right, in a way. The Red Orchestra survivors who hadn't been caught were still there, waiting for the Red Army. There is a story of an SS officer in the final days running into a colleague in the burning hallway of the RSHA. "Who are we fighting?" he asked. "The Russians? The Americans? Or the man in the office next to me?" The discipline collapsed. The fear of the enemy within had eaten the organization alive. They had spent 12 years building a police state where everyone watched everyone. In the end, that system turned on itself. They couldn't coordinate a defense of Berlin because they didn't trust the reports coming from their own commanders. Was the report real? Or was it another Allied trick? Was the general on the phone a loyalist, or had he already cut a deal with the Russians? The ultimate irony of the SS is that their obsession with purity and loyalty created a system that was incredibly vulnerable to deception. Because they couldn't imagine a loyal Aryan betraying them, they were blind to the ones who did. And because they were terrified of failure, they buried the evidence of infiltration until it was too late. When the war ended, the Allies interrogated the surviving SS intelligence chiefs, men like Walter Schellenberg and Horst Kopkow. And what they found in these interrogations was not a group of mastermind villains who knew everything. They found men who were confused. They found men who asked the interrogators, "So, was Agent X really yours? Was the report from 1943 a lie?" When the Allied officers nodded, the SS men would just stare. The reality of their humiliation was total. The SS liked to project an image of omniscience. They wanted the world to think they saw everything. But the discovery of Allied spies, from the Red Orchestra to the double-cross agents, revealed that they were stumbling in the dark. They were a terrifying organization, yes. Brutal, yes. But they were also deeply incompetent, blinded by their own ideology, and crippled by the very paranoia they inflicted on others. The lesson they learned too late is that you cannot build a secure system on fear. When everyone is afraid to report the truth stops coming. And when the truth stops coming, you are fighting a war against a map that doesn't exist. The SS thought they were the hunters. But for much of the war, they were the prey, being watched, manipulated, and steered toward their own destruction by the very spies they thought they were too smart to catch. If you enjoyed this look into the shadow war of World War II, make sure you are subscribed to Hidden Horizon Hub. We have more stories coming about the secret history of the 20th century, stories you won't find in the standard textbooks. Hit the like button to help us break through the algorithm, and I'll see you in the next video.